Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the Spring University Studying Slavery Conference. I'm Andrew Davenport, a PhD student in U.S. history here at Georgetown, a research assistant with the Georgetown Slavery Archive, and a TA in Professor Adam Rothman's Facing Georgetown's History course. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I thank you for the invitation to speak about the significance of this day, DC Emancipation Day. Emancipation Day is an official holiday in Washington, D.C. It commemorates the Compensated Emancipation Act signed by President Abraham Lincoln on April 16, 1862, which ended slavery in the nation's capital. Lisa Frazier, a historian and steward of Black Georgetown history, reminds us that the district also has the distinction of being the only part of the United States to have compensated enslavers for freeing enslaved persons they held. In addition to compensating enslavers, the act provided for payments of as much as $100 to African Americans who agreed to move to Haiti or Liberia. Only a handful of free people opted to emigrate. The vast majority chose to stay and exercise their newfound freedom in the US. A congressman from Ohio complained that the abolition of slavery in Washington was the beginning of a grand scheme of emancipation, and there is no calculation where that scheme is to end. And that was precisely the point. Charles Sumner said that the Emancipation Act was the first installment of that great debt which we all owe to enslaved people. The good work will not stop here, Sumner said. It must proceed. Aaron Edmondson, enslaved at Georgetown College, was one of the 3,000 enslaved Washingtonians immediately emancipated in 1862. As my Georgetown Slavery Archive colleagues Corey Young and Elsa Barraza Mendoza have shown, Edmondson was enslaved as a domestic servant in the college dormitories. He was about 30 years old at the time of emancipation. I think of him and the many others enslaved at the university I attend every day. The first post-Civil War celebration of Emancipation Day occurred on this date in 1866, when thousands of Black Washingtonians paraded from Georgetown to the Capitol. This fabulous occasion not only celebrated freedom, but was also an opportunity for Black Washingtonians to mobilize and demonstrate their strength and resilience for future political struggles in DC and beyond. On that date in 1866, the great Henry Highland Garnett, pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church and formerly enslaved in Maryland, gave a speech saying, "Today the principles of liberty are triumphant. God is with us and we must be free." Emancipation Day reminds us that a different world, a better world, is possible. You and I are charged with studying our past, analyzing our present, and imagining a future free from the legacies of slavery that plague us today. On Emancipation Day 2021, we participate in an inspiring tradition stretching back to the 1860s. The good work will not stop here. It must proceed. As Mayor Bowser says, from emancipation to statehood. Happy Emancipation Day to you all. Thank you. And now it is my honor to introduce you to Anne-Marie Kucha with the GU Students for DC Statehood, who will moderate our panel, Emancipation Without Representation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. I also want to say thank you to the President's Office for recognizing this as an important cause and giving us space to talk to you about this today. Like Andrew said, I'm the president of GU Students for DC Statehood, which is an on-campus organization fighting for DC statehood and informing other students about the importance of statehood. I'm going to introduce the other panelists, if they could each turn their cameras on as I introduce them. We're joined today by Jamal Holtz, a lead organizer for 51 for 51, an organization fighting for statehood through 51 votes in the Senate. He's a native Washingtonian and currently serves as the project manager and assistant to the president at Link Strategic Partners. We're also glad to have Beverly Perry, the senior advisor to Mayor Muriel Bowser in the DC's government. In this capacity, she advises the mayor on policy initiatives through her oversight of the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs, the Office of Federal and Regional Affairs, and the Office of the Secretary. And finally, we have Assistant Professor Jamil Scott, the Professor of Government at Georgetown University. She received her doctorate from Michigan State in political science and her bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland. So we're going to start today by talking a little bit about the history of DC statehood as linked with slavery. I'm going to throw that topic first to Senior Advisor Perry. Ms. Perry, I think you're muted. Yep.
Got it. Thank you, Anne Marie. You know, the statehood movement was not always connected to slavery, but this year we wanted to change that narrative, and we wanted to make sure that the history was the correlation between slavery and the lack of representation were connected. So we have this Emancipation Day, we have produced a documentary to chronicle that history. It will air today on CBS. We believe that the civil rights of the lack of representation was just as important as the enslavement, because we are still not free until we have full democracy and full participation in our national government.
Yeah, Professor Scott, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure. So I would say here that there is a real conversation to be had about disenfranchisement and what it means that DC tags still say taxation without representation, right? And so as we have these conversations about what's happening in Georgia, right, how voters are being taken off the rolls, how voters are progressively being changes are being made to progressively not allow voters to vote, right, and have their interests be heard, right? We can talk about Georgia, but that conversation needs to also be happening in DC, a majority Black city. Well, not majority anymore. I think we might be calling it the latte city right now, 46% Black at this point. But there's a large Black population here. And it's meaningful to have that conversation about what it means that there's a population here who does not have the same representation, right? Does not have the same ability to vote and have their voices be heard, right? And so we can talk about and relate this to these conversations around the 14th and 15th Amendment because they're meaningful, right? There's a population here that can't vote, right? In the same way that we would like to think. And in my own research, as I've talked to voters, right, they've had these conversations about why does it even matter, right? Why does it even matter that I show up to the polls on a local election, on a national election, right? That is a clear, I would say, problem, right? That voters don't feel like their voice matters. And what does that mean for this question of everyone has a right to vote, right? When people don't even feel like their vote, their voice is meaningful, right? That is DC voters saying that in focus groups. They don't feel like they matter, right? What does that mean for the question of representation overall? It means that there's a population here that does not feel like they're heard, that does not feel that their participation in the democratic process is meaningful, and that's a problem. Right? That's a big problem here. And so all of this ties together, right? Because this population in DC, the Black population in DC in particular, has things to say, right? They have something to say, and they need to be heard here on this issue of statehood, on the issue of voting and how their voting matters, right? And I, as a researcher, I, as someone who is listening to voters, can in good conscience continue to be in this space where they don't feel like they don't matter at all.
Yeah, Jamal, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, again, like honoring what this day is it's Emancipation Day. When over, as mentioned, when over 3,000 enslaved Black people were free in DC, they never imagined 159 years later that their descendants will still be fighting for freedom and representation. And when we talk about what our demands are and what our talk is that we're demanding to end emancipation without representation. And Black Americans have always had to fight to have equal access to democracy. From the moment we saw enslaved people be removed from their hometowns and brought into America. And sadly, in 2021, at 23 years old, I'm still fighting for my civil rights. And that's truly a stain on our democracy. It's a stain on our country history, and it's a stain on our Constitution. DC statehood is truly a racial justice issue. The majority of DC residents are Black and brown, and ignoring their voices in Congress is it's unjust. It's the slave mentality. The slave mentality is centered around control. It is how can we control a population and what they do, what they say, and their power. And that's what the slave mentality was in the 1800s, and that's what the slave mentality is now with DC lack of statehood. And as Dr. Martin Luther King said, I have to highlight this, is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And if you were marching the streets last summer and talked about racial justice and talked about equity and talked about Black Lives Matter, then you should care and still be talking about DC statehood, because right now we're living in a state of suppression where there are Black voices, Black people Black people in power whose voices are limited and suppressed because of our lack of statehood. So we're still fighting for our freedom to this day. I wear a shirt all the time on Juneteenth, and it's on the back of it says, "No one is free until everyone is free." And on Juneteenth was that day where all African Americans were free. But we're still fighting that mantra and that motto now. No one is free until everyone is free. And there's American citizens who don't have representation and live under the congressional tyranny that we see every day in this country.
Yeah, before we move on to the next question, I just want to remind all the attendees that if you're in the attendee hub, there should be a button on the top right of your screen where you can ask questions if you have questions for any of our panelists. But I'd like Ms. Perry or Jamal, if one of you could give a brief overview of the statehood movement and where it's at right now, so that people who are less familiar understand where the movement is at.
Well, let me just say, the statehood movement is at the best place it's ever been. And for the people that are not aware, the Admissions Act to admit Washington, D.C. as the 51st state was heard in the House of Representatives before the committee, the House Oversight and Reform Committee. It was marked up and was voted out of committee 2 days ago. The majority leader has committed to take that vote to the House floor next week. So next week, on the 22nd, 21st, 22nd, we are expecting the House of Representatives for the second time to pass the Admissions Act. And then we will move to the Senate. And as we move to the Senate, we already have 45 co-sponsors in the Senate. And as I said today earlier on a TV station, we need 5 more votes. And so we believe in the Senate, and assuming that when I say we need 5 more votes, we need 5 more co-sponsors, assuming that the Senate will pass a rule that statehood is one of those things that is paramount to the right to vote. And there's a movement to take those things that are essential to our birthrights, our rights as American citizens, to not be subject to the filibuster. And if you take statehood, if the Senate passes a rule that would take statehood out of the filibuster category, we only need 5 more votes, with the vice president breaking the tie. So I'm optimistic that that could happen. And so I think 2021 is the year. And I just want to add to what the 2 prior speakers said, Jamal and the professor, is that this right to vote is embedded in racism. It is embedded in racism. It was when in 1790, when the Congress decided to move the capital to the banks of the Potomac, they did it to protect slavery. They instituted a local government because Congress wanted to have a legislative control area for the federal district. And then when they saw that local government becoming too Black, they abolished it. They did that 2 times in history. We had a local government, they abolished it. And each time, and we're now working on the home rule, which is about 40 years old. And what did Congress say? They say, oh, you're not capable of being a state. You can't manage your own affairs. And we have balanced 24 years of budgets for 24 years. We have a AAA bond rating. We pay the highest taxes per capita of any state in America. We pay more taxes than 22 states. But yes, the only excuse we can get is that you can't manage your affairs, which is code for saying you're too Black or you're too brown.
Or they say things like you don't have car dealerships or landfills, which is code for saying you're too Black and you're too brown. And like Ms. Perry said, like statehood fights over the years in our country's history has always been about race and embedded into whether or not the shift of power was going to play a role. I think about the fight for statehood with New Mexico and Hawaii. Segregationists didn't want to admit Hawaii and New Mexico into the Union because their populations were majority people of color, majority Black and brown people. And just like DC, now you got senators like Tom Cotton and other Republicans who use racist dog whistles tactics to block DC statehood, saying things like DC don't have real people. Like, look at me, I'm real. Ms. Perry's real. Like we're real people that live here, that raise families here. Or they say things like DC don't have lodgers and factory workers, which I never knew the Constitution laid out that being a lodger or a factory worker was equal to having representation. And that's what is felt like to live in the district for many years. And in this fight for statehood, the urgency in this moment is now. Right, we're closer now more than ever, right, and that's because of the fight that over this is an intergenerational fight that generations of my family and many other families in the District of Columbia have fought for this, have fought for representation, have fought for voting rights, and have fought for the opportunity to be represented in the government that's supposed to, in the democracy that's supposed to represent them, right? We, at 51 for 51, we spent, when we launched this campaign 2 years ago, we spent time and time traveling across the country to talk to then presidential candidates about the importance of passing DC statehood with 51 votes in the Senate and bypassing the filibuster. And we locked in people like President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. But the important piece for me was being able to connect with people in those communities to say, we are real people that live here. We raise families here and I exist, right? Like we're not just a town of where you come and visit the monuments, and you'll be amazed at how many people, one, that doesn't know that DC isn't a state, or two, that doesn't know that we don't have votes in the Congress. And this fight for me is truly personal. And when I got involved in my community and got involved with advocating on behalf of many different issues that were important to my community, it was personal because those were a lot of issues that I was seeing in my own household. In 2014, when there was huge talks about the Affordable Care Act and making provisions to that to ensure every uninsured American had access to basic health insurance, had access to preventative care. That was something my mom didn't have. That was something I didn't have. So that fight for me was important. And as I was advocating for Affordable Care Act and something that when we had our first African-American president pushing, like the Affordable Care Act, it isn't a Democrat issue. It's it's American families who did not have health insurance, and it would have gave them basic health insurance. And at that time when I was advocating for it, it was call your senator, reach out to your representative. And at that point, I noticed my advocacy ended at the mayor's office, that my shadow senator didn't have a vote in our Congress, that my delegate to the House also didn't have a vote. So we cannot continue to count our days where we're living in the shadows of democracy. And that's what this fight is all about. It's a fight for Black power, to fight to show us that Black lives do matter. And it's a fight to show us that our voices matter. 56 years ago, we were fighting for voting rights, the Civil Rights Act for African Americans in this country. 56 years later, we're still fighting for the same thing for the residents of Washington, D.C. So we gotta pass D.C. statehood now and do that with 51 votes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jamal, and leads us into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is just, what concretely would statehood change for the lives of people in the district? What does it mean for people to be disenfranchised? And what are the actual impacts of that on individuals? I'll go to Ms. Perry first.
Well, number one is last year we saw 2 Supreme Court justices that seated on the Supreme Court. And regardless of what your political persuasions are, the fact that you have no voice, no one to call. In the House, we have Mrs. Norton, we have a delegate. In the Senate, we have no one to call. And let me tell you another disadvantage. Last year, when under the Republicans passed the CARES Act for COVID, we had a pandemic that had stricken our country, and our city was very hard hit. And our city has always been treated as a state under every grant program there is. We researched it and we found in the US Code like 500 different times that when DC was considered a state. But yet, when we were in this health crisis in America, the biggest health crisis ever stricken our country in our lifetime, the Congress gave us 1/3 of the money that it gave the states. And we were harder hit than most of those states. And so we have fought for 9 months, and thank God yesterday that we were made whole, that $755 million that we were shortchanged last year went into the DC account just yesterday. But it's that kind of thing, health and safety. When you look at what happened on January 6th, the insurrectionists, our police chief deployed 1,000 police officers, DC police officers, to protect the democracy of America that we don't have a voice in. How ironic is that? I don't care what your political persuasions are. You don't put your life on the line for something you can't even participate in. But we do. We did that. Our police officers did that. And they do that every day. So those are some of the disadvantages. It has to stop. The mayor can't deploy the National Guard. All the governors, even Governor Hogan from Maryland had called the mayor and said, you need help, I will deploy my National Guard. Even for him to send his National Guard, the White House had to approve. How crazy is that? So those are some of the disadvantages and some of the things that we have to overcome. And we must overcome them. We need everybody that under the reign of my voice across the world, we need your help. And right now we are 5 senators away. We will have a bill going over to the Senate within the next 2 weeks. And we need Arizona We need New Hampshire. We need Maine.
That's right. Can I add to that, Emery? It's January 6th, like Ms. Perry highlighted, like so much that could have played a role in saving our democracy sooner. But in the COVID relief and all that, the impacts that had on local residents. But January 6th itself, it was a day like many other days in our country's history. It was a day that started with Black joy and ended with white hate. It was a day where we saw the election of 2 new Georgia senators, and that morning, and Ms. Perry, I know you felt the same. It was amazing to see 2 new senators that were coming to the Senate that supported DC statehood, that talked about voting rights. And for us, we were like, this is we're getting it. Like we're getting it this year. This is our moment. And to see a few hours later, your capital under cease and insurrectionists and mobs trying to overturn democracy in elections, that it was a day like many others in our country, but it was the entrenched systems of white supremacy that protected those people on that day. But however, the implications of that day impacted DC residents the most. And it impacted our country, and it was a stain on our democracy. But imagine what it felt like to be a DC resident on that day. Let me just put you into that perspective. It was a day where the mayor was forced to put out a curfew, and that forced restaurants to close. Many restaurant owners closed their restaurants early, and grocery stores closed early. My grocery store closed at 6 p.m. And I had to rush downstairs. 4 p.m. actually, and I had to rush downstairs to get food at 3:30. But even that, like so many hourly employees lost wages on that day, to where later in the month or in the weeks they couldn't put have as much money as they would have had to put food on the table, pay rent, and that was an impact on DC residents. Transportation, the public transportation system closed early, and many people who were essential workers and worked late, who depended on public transportation to get home, they didn't have that on that day. I think about people like my late grandmother, who we just laid to rest last week, who was battling stage 4 cancer that day and depended on her home health aide to come and visit her every day. But that day she couldn't come visit her because of what was happening in the city, right? Like those things aren't unique to me or many other families. Those things happen to DC residents on January 6th. And when we saw everything that played out on that day, it was truly the highlight on the reasons why DC should be a state. And in that moment, like people, I'm frustrated now because I get tired of people only coming to us to talk about statehood when there's something major that happens, right? When there's an insurrection that happens, or when the conversations are at a high on the hill, right? But like people who live in Washington D.C., like the 3 people you see on the screen, everybody who you see on the screen are fighting for this stuff every day, and fighting for these things for years, and we can't continue to count our days where there's Black people who don't have voting rights in this city. Like we can't preach democracy and not practice democracy in that same vein.
Let me also add here that I think that DC statehood is the arguments around DC statehood has made DC almost a pawn here, right? In a larger argument about control in the House and the Senate, right? There are arguments against DC statehood just simply because, right, we are in a state of our country where the party numbers aren't matching up to what everybody wants, right? In terms of there's a limiting power effect. There's an assumption that, right, rightfully so, given voting behavior, that DC would become a Democratic state, right? And what would that mean for Republican control and Republican power? There are concerns there. And so instead of thinking about folks on the ground, DC is being used as a pawn, right? In an argument about larger control of the presidency, of the House and the Senate, right? And so we lose the conversation about the people, and it becomes a conversation about larger party control. And that's problematic. right? In addition, there are real federalism arguments to be thinking about here. A governor in a state can oppose the president, and in some regards, right? There can be a back and forth. We've seen this with Michigan. You can see this a bit with Governor Hogan, our nearest neighbor here, right? But DC doesn't have that same power, right? And so how can an elected official garner trust from the people they represent when they can't, when elected officials don't have the same power, right? So what does it mean to have an elected official who is very limited in what they can do? It means that there's a lack of trust here. It means that it goes back to this idea of why I even vote when people that I vote for don't have the same amount of power, right? It leads to this degradation of what people think about democracy and the democratic system. Why should I be involved when the elected officials that I put in place, that I vote for, can't do anything for me? What does that mean? So we have a whole set of people here who don't feel the same about democratic systems, right? That's problematic.
Yeah, Professor Scott, that's a great point. And that leads into, I think, the other thing we wanted to talk about, which is, I know that you all have pointed out that this lack of control erodes the values that DC residents do have and limits the ability of DC residents to, implement policies that they support. So if you all could talk a little bit about, the types of things that DC would be able to do if it was a state, the policies that the federal government has blocked, and how that's harmed DC residents. And Ms. Perry, you can start.
Well, number one, we will have 2 senators, and our senators will have votes, and we will have a voice. And what most people don't understand, not having a voice in the Senate, you only have a half a voice in the executive branch, because you vote for the president, but the president appoints a cabinet, and the Senate has to confirm it or reject the cabinet members. So you don't have a say in who represent who run different agencies, and you have no voice in the federal judiciary system because that is only for the Senate. So the number one goal is to have 2 senators and a voting member in the House of Representatives. The other thing is, what most people don't know, the federal district, the District of Columbia, the Constitution says that the Congress has exclusive legislative jurisdiction. And what that means, and the way that's translated and manifested today, is that any member of Congress doesn't like the values of DC. Any member of Congress, just one single member, can decide. They will put a rider on any bill to decide to say, overturn a law that's been passed by our legislative branch, signed by our mayor, and a congressman from Southern Maryland can decide they don't like that. And it happens all the time. It has happened in reproductive rights. It has happened in budget items. It happened when we had an AIDS crisis 10 years ago, and proven science, you could have needle exchange programs to save lives. A Republican Congress member don't believe in needle exchanges, so they put a rider on a bill. We can't even save the lives of our citizens that have a problem. So there are a number of things like that. So I would say our voices in the Senate, our legislator, our vote in the House, and the independence to make our own laws that commiserate with the values of the residents of the District of Columbia. Period. That's what we want.
Yeah, Jamal or Professor Scott, would you guys like to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ms. Perry covered it pretty well. like the Senate gives more voting power to white America and less to everybody else. As calculated, like whites have 0.35 senators per million people, while blacks have 0.26, and Asian Americans have about 0.25, and Latinos 0.19. That's a huge difference as you think about the representation that exists right now in our Congress, and adding two more senators, adding a voting member of the House to our federal government would not only be a changing day for Washington, D.C., it will, correct me, it would not only be a changing day for the Douglas Commonwealth, but it would be a changing day for America. Is that the day we put two new senators in a voting member in the House is the day that Americans finally get to have a second, another voice on gun reform, on gun violence prevention, on affordable health care, on women's reproductive rights. Those are things that we care about as DC residents, and those are DC values. Congress has time after time have attempted to overturn and block things that we fought for locally, and dictating how we spend our local dollars when it comes to supporting women's reproductive rights and attempting to overturn our gun laws. And these are things that we want as DC residents. These are things that protect us as residents and things that we're asking our local council and our local mayor to do. And we have to center this issue as an American issue. It's an American fight. Is that if we truly believe in the ideals of our Constitution, that we're the home of the free and the land of the free and the home of the brave, then we have to be brave and stand up for DC residents, for fellow American citizens who pay full taxes in this government, where over 30,000 DC residents have served in our country's military and done their due diligence to be full participants in this democracy. But in turn, we need you to be brave with us and fight with us, because that's what lack of DC statehood has always been. We relied on other Americans to fight on our behalf, and we really need you to fight right now. And this isn't about politics. This is not about politics. It's not about party, because DC makes up Democrats. There's Democrats in DC. There's Republicans in DC. There's independents in DC. There's Statehood Party, Green Party people in DC. Like this is about people. So we have to continue to value people over party and not let the party politics define what democracy means for our residents, for American citizens.
I'll also say here that what is also a problem is that DC becomes at the whim of who is in power at the time, right? Like if we think about what happened when there was gridlock, right? And DC, the federal part of DC shut down, right? But DC as a city still had to operate. So what does that mean for this space? What does that mean for the people who work here and live here? That's a problem. In addition to that, right, I don't think we've touched on the criminal justice system and how DC is a very interesting space because there are limits to local control. So if you, certainly misdemeanors are handled by, so cases are handled by cases are handled by DC Superior Court judges, right? So that's federal control, right? But if you're incarcerated, you might go to a DC jail, or you could go to a federal prison. And so there are differences in outcomes here, and we can think about how that impacts lengths of imprisonment, how it impacts outcomes for folks who are supervised, how it impacts recidivism rates, etc. Right? As a citizen in DC, right, you are coming in contact with the federal criminal justice system more than people in other parts of the country, right? And that has implications for outcomes, right? Who is in jail, how long they stay in jail, etc. Right? In addition, right, we can also think here about how there, what's the best way to say this? Folks who are at the federal level, right, they might want to be seen, right? And what do I mean by that? That they might be trying to build a reputation to be taken up at another place, right? That they want to maybe build a reputation to be seen as someone who could potentially be a Supreme Court justice. You build a reputation, right? So there are politics built into how, and even though people don't like to talk about it, the judiciary is political, right? And there are politics built into how someone might behave or how they might think about their sentence and impact and the implications of all of that, right? That we're not only just thinking about when the DC, or rather when federal judiciary gets in the mix, we're not just talking about how folks are ruling at a local level. We're now thinking about making comparisons between DC circuit, right, and other circuits. So they're making comparable decisions or not trying to get or figuring out how to get the Supreme Court involved or not, right? And those are political decisions there, right? And that has implications for people's lives in a way that you wouldn't, in a way that wouldn't matter for you if you lived in Maryland or Virginia. There are different levels to the court system that you have to get to first before you would even think about having the potential to be in contact with the circuit system, right? And that's not the case here.
Can I add quickly to that? It's also a slave trade mentality when it comes to our courts and where our residents go to serve prison time or jail time. Is we send, not we, federal government send, because we don't have control over our local courts and prison systems. We send our residents to places like New Mexico, to North Carolina, far away from here, where they don't get an opportunity to reintegrate back into their communities like many others, where they stay within a certain radius of where their residency is. And that's a problem for returning citizens, that they're also American citizens, and as many people have had second chances in their lives, we also should give returning citizens the second chance of being reintegrated back into their communities and where their residency is. So that is a Black issue at its heart, because when we're literally putting people, sometimes low income, poor Black Americans in other communities, and the slave trade mentality, taking people from one place of their hometown and taking them somewhere else where they're next to be. And when we're seeing that, in essence, you got low income Black people who are in poverty that struggle when they are left in communities that they don't know and have to figure out a new walk of life and figure out what life means for them, but also don't have any money or funding to get back to their hometown if they're hundreds of miles away. And that's a struggle for Black Americans, especially ones that come from DC. So I want to highlight that because I think that's a part of the slave trade mentality.
And Anne Marie, if I can just add a couple of points. With the criminal justice system, the number one issue is they have no accountability, as Professor Scott said, to the citizens of the District of Columbia. They have no accountability. The president appoints the judges, and the whole system is federally run. What we want is a criminal justice system that is accountable to the people. And that's the difference in Maryland and other states, our local judges. And that's and the other thing, what I mentioned earlier about why it's so important. Even if the people go before federal judges, we have no comments, we have no senators to talk to about the federal judges that are appointed on the federal courts in the District of Columbia. But let me make another point as well. One of the most outspoken senators against statehood is from Wyoming. We are larger than Wyoming. We pay more taxes than Wyoming, you know, and I think we probably have a more diverse economy. I haven't looked to see if Wyoming has a AAA bond rating, but this is the kind of criticism that we get. You think about, we are larger than Wyoming. We are larger than Vermont. We have a larger population. We have an equal population to like 5 other jurisdictions, including Alaska. Alaska has maybe 15,000 people more than DC. But the point that Jamal was making about the lack of representation, if you live in an urban area, I don't care where you live in an urban area, whether it's New York, San Francisco, you should be concerned about the representation in the Senate of urban areas. Let me give you an example. If you go to the West, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Idaho, all combined have about 5 million people. If you look at Maryland, DC, and Virginia, we have 15 million people. We have 3 times more people, and they have 1/10 of the Senate. Just 5 states with 5 million people have 1/10 of the Senate, of the US Senate. So that's one of the inequities. That's unfair representation. It's all slanted to, you know, those small agricultural type states. And you know, we were criticized for not having mines. We were criticized for not having cows. We were criticized for not having car dealerships. We do have car dealerships. We were criticized for not having a landfill. I mean, is that the difference in why this Constitution, the US Constitution, that stands for the principles of freedom and equal protection, is that how we're going to apply it? I don't think so.
Yeah, and I saw there was a question about what states have smaller populations than DC, and Ms. Perry mentioned the ones with smaller populations are Wyoming and Vermont. And we're pretty close to both Alaska and North Dakota. Another point I will add quickly is that there are a lot of people who technically live in Maryland and Virginia, but work in DC. So there are a lot more than the residents of DC who would be impacted by statehood. We're gonna move now into a question about alternate ways to fix the problem. So I saw that there was one question about could we advance to statehood by degrees. The example they gave was get the representative the vote first and then the senator, and then finally get official statehood. I know that people have also proposed the idea of retrocession, which is returning DC to Maryland or Virginia. So I'd like to give you all the chance to respond to sort of those 2 alternate ideas. Ms. Perry, if you'd like to start.
Well, retrocession is not an option. And Majority Leader Hoyer, the most senior member of the House, second most senior member of the House, period, but the most senior member of the House from Maryland, in the documentary that we will air today, he is very adamant. Retrocession to Maryland is not an option. We have developed our own culture. We have developed our own independent jurisdiction. We have developed our own economy, and we don't want to go and merge into someone else's economy. That's what Black people have had to do their entire lives. They had to try to emulate someone else, had to try to be part of something that they're not. We are not part of Maryland. We don't want to be part of Maryland. Maryland don't want us. And so that's a good thing. With respect to getting a vote in the House, that doesn't give us representation in the Senate. The Senate is where the action is. If you don't have representation in the Senate in this country, you are not represented. You only have a vote for the President of the United States. And that doesn't even get you to who the president picks to serve. I mean, you have like a third of a vote. And that's not enough. It's not even a half a loaf. We don't want that. And that is not what the Constitution offers us. We want equal rights. I want the same representation if I lived in Georgia, or if I lived in Maryland. I want that representation. I want a congressperson and 2 senators.
To the point about retrocession, I think that ignores, like Ms. Perry said, the culture built here, but also that adds a whole nother tax burden and tax integration problem to Maryland, right? And that assumes that Maryland wants to take that on. Nobody wants to take on that is a problematic assumption that a city with its own infrastructure, own culture, own leadership can just be folded into another state. That doesn't make sense here, right? That also just assumes that that is an easy process, and it's not. Right? It's not an easy process. And so what is easier, what makes more sense is to speak to DC remaining, or DC being its own entity, DC being its own state, right? Where they can continue and continue to keep their infrastructure and build out their infrastructure such that it mirrors the capacity in Maryland, in Virginia, and in other states.
Yeah, and when I hear retrocession, I literally say that's the equation to suppression, right? Is that the retrocession is literally only furthering 200 years of erasure of 700,000 mostly Black and brown residents who have, like mentioned, Professor Scott mentioned, who have their own culture and history. It will be whitewashing us to place DC residents in a majority white state. But I mean, the point is greater than that, right? It's an important point because it's a racial justice piece, but this point is very important, that this country founded, the founding of this country started as 13 colonies, 13 states. We went from 13 to 50 in 200 years. Like, if we didn't have a problem with going from 13 to 50, then we damn sure shouldn't have a problem with going to 13 to 51. And that's not what DC residents want. We don't want to be a part of anybody else's state. We support, and everybody else should support, the rights to self-determination and self-representation. We passed a referendum that said make us a state, and overwhelmingly over 86% of DC residents supported that. So, like, nobody asked North Dakota to join South Dakota when they were becoming a state. Nobody is asking to combine New York and New Jersey. So nobody's asking to combine like these states down south that all got land from other states, from the original 13 colonies, to become states. So, like, this isn't about like adding 2 more Democratic senators or adding DC to another state. Like, this is about ensuring that the people in Washington, in the Douglas Commonwealth, have an opportunity to the representation that that our Constitution lays out. It's actually unconstitutional that you have American citizens who do not have representation in their government. Like, that's unconstitutional. Like,
and you know, there's oh, I'm sorry, Jamal.
No, you go, because I was gonna get angry.
There's one other thing too that the documentary focuses on, that's going to be shown later today, and that is the founding fathers never intended to disenfranchise the inhabitants of the nation's capital. They recognized it. They talked about it at the Continental Congress. They said it had to be corrected. The founding fathers said, we can't create this beacon of freedom and not, we're going against, we creating this, so there will not be taxation without representation. We can't do that. We have to correct it. They talked about it at the Continental Congress, and they didn't get to fix it. And Congress has had this issue before them for 230 years. It is time for this to be fixed. 220 years, 1790, when the Congress decided to move to the banks of the Potomac. 220 years. And it's been talked about, and it needs to be corrected.
So we have about 5 more minutes, and I'm going to ask the last question. And as part of answering this, if you all can also kind of wrap up and summarize your kind of closing thoughts. The last question is, can you speak to the alliances the DC movement has made with activists in other states, and how those of us not living in DC can contribute to the movement for DC statehood? And I'll go to Jamal first on this one.
Dang, I was going to think of my answer. No, I mean, the alliance is truly, the alliance in this fight is truly the American creed in this fight. Is that we talk about the soul of this nation and talk about getting back to the true creed of what this country is. But if we're going to live up to that true creed, that all people are created equal, then we have to stop counting our days where there are American citizens who do not have representation. And we spent the last 2 years, 51 for 51, going across the country and building those coalitions with organizers and local groups to uplift the movement. But also, this fight wasn't just, it isn't going to get accomplished by myself, Ms. Perry, or Professor Scott from constantly talking about the same things that we care about. It's going to get accomplished from the three of us continuously building coalitions. And I remember a year ago, 2 years ago, I think it was, Ms. Perry, we were down in Austin and getting those low, and not only talking about in the DC statehood, in the DC House, but going into those communities and saying, this is an important fight. Like, this fight isn't going to be achieved by just DC residents. We need your, like, sadly, we need your help. But that's what this fight is all about, and it is truly making it an American fight and living up to the ideals. We launched a campaign on Why We Can't Wait, .org, and visit that site and get involved. Email your local, if you aren't from DC, email your legislature, email your congress member and your senator, and tell them, if they do support DC statehood, tell them thank you. But if they don't, and if they aren't signed or co-sponsors, urge them to become co-sponsors and urge them to pass the House bill next week, hopefully. And then when we're reaching our hurdle in the Senate, urge them to pass it in the Senate as well.
Professor Scott?
I would certainly agree with Jamal's ending statements about if you're not from DC, take a moment to reach out to your office holders and have that conversation, right? The big thing is to not just create visibility here, but also to make it clear that others are paying attention. And so as not having representation here, it needs to be seen, and it's helpful to be able to say that there are folks who care about this and they're watching, right? And so there is an accountability piece here to be had about being able to say, I'm watching my senator, I'm watching my House of Rep member to see what type of decision they make here. And that'll impact my vote next time, right? Because they care about re-election, right? So if you're paying attention to their decision making, that matters.
And Ms. Perry, if you'd like to close us out real quick.
Okay, I'll close you out. I would urge everyone to go to statehood.dc.gov, which is the city's website on statehood. We have an educational campaign ongoing. We can't do lobbying, but we do have an educational campaign, and we have taken that across America. I will say to you that there are probably 15 states that have resolutions before their legislature, and there are only 2 that are in opposition. So we're working it, and this is the point. anyone that feels that all Americans should be treated equally should understand that all Americans should have voting representation in the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, thank you all so much. If you're a member of the Georgetown community, feel free to reach out to GU Students for DC Statehood, and we can definitely get you connected with the fight. But thank you all so much to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much to the conference and to all of those of you watching. And I encourage you to go to other panels throughout the day and have a wonderful and powerful Emancipation Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.